Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's Living Atlas community webinar, Make Meaningful Maps About Your Community Using the Living Atlas. To kick things off, please take a minute or two to answer the poll question. And in this poll question, we really want to know, what do you consider the hardest part when it comes to making a good map about policy? Is it getting good data, interpreting that data, choosing a spatial analysis method, making the map itself, or simply coming up with ideas? So please let us know your answers through the poll question, and then we'll review the results and get started with the presentation. All right, I want to thank everyone for answering the poll question. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And here, I'm going to share the results with all of you. So you can see the hardest part for many of you is finding good data. And this is a really, really great presentation for you to be a part of, because we'll show the Living Atlas and how you can take advantage of data in the Living Atlas to create maps about policy. And it looks like second, coming up with ideas was the second hardest part about creating a good map, which, I mean, it's a hard subject for a lot of us, and really you need to make sure you're asking the right questions and finding the right answers when you're creating policy maps. And I know Jim and Jennifer will also discuss that in their presentation. And then third, choosing a spatial analysis method. What's the best way I can analyze this data and review this data and then present the data in a map to show the results that I want to show, that I need to show, that are appropriate. So again, thank you for answering the poll question, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. So I'd like to welcome you to our November 2017 Living Atlas webinar. My name's Tamara Grant, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, there are a few general housekeeping items I'd like to discuss. The webinar is being recorded, and it should be available by the beginning of next week, if not before. You'll be sent a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording, and you can also find the recording on our Living Atlas of the World website and our Facebook page. While the presentation is going on, please feel free to send us your questions through the questions panel. And we'll have some time at the end where I'll ask those questions to the presenters before we wrap up with some final announcements. So we really have a great presentation lined up for you today. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers. And we have Jim, Herries and Jennifer Bell today. And Jim is a product engineer who focuses on cartography in ArcGIS Online. On initiatives like the Smart Mapping Project, he works with teams to help our products make clear, focused map products that include meaningful spatial analysis and evocative visualizations. He serves as a map curator for the Urban Observatory and the Living Atlas of the World, two long-term projects whose emphasis is on visually appealing and useful map information products. And Jennifer is a cartographic product engineer on Esri's ArcGIS Online content team. Through meaningful spatial analysis, eye-catching visualizations, and engaging storytelling, she creates innovative and thought-provoking maps for the Living Atlas of the World. So with that, let's go ahead and hand it over to them for the presentation.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks for the introductions. Those are, I hope we can live up to those in general and specifically over the next, about 50 minutes. I'm Jim Herries, this is Jennifer Bell.
Hey everyone.
And we're just hanging out here with you today for the next 50 minutes to talk about policy mapping and how we have experienced it over the past year or so. And I want to start off by referring to this diagram. I came across this Prezi template, and I thought it was a perfect metaphor for talking about policy mapping. You know, the thought of an iceberg floating on the ocean, and you know, it's not necessarily the part you can see that gets you, it's the part that you can't see. When we talk about policy mapping, one of our touchstones is a statement made by Stephen Goldsmith in December 2015. He and I were having a discussion, and he was trying to explain what a policy map was to me so that I could be a more effective resource for him. And I asked, you know, I put a map of median household income up on screen. I said, well, what is the difference between this map of median household income and a policy map? He said, oh, it's real straightforward. A policy map is where an opportunity to intervene is made clear. And that's been sort of my touchstone ever since. So, you know, on screen you see 3 maps showing the exact same thing. These are, what are these, Jennifer? Is it traffic accidents, I think, in Pasadena, is it?
Yeah, these are collision points, pedestrian collision points.
Pedestrian collision points. Isn't that amazing? So over some period of time, I think this was like a year or a couple of years of data, every one of those dots on the map involves the unfortunate collision between a pedestrian and a vehicle of some sort. And on the right, it's a heat map version of that. And on the top, it's a hex bin map of that where they've aggregated the number of collisions into a somewhat arbitrary geography. And the question is, which of these is a policy map? And you can see I've given you the answer. It's none of these. None of these are a policy map. This is a map of data. The dots, certainly, everybody on this call probably has seen or made a map like this as one of the first steps in the process, right? Let's get the data on the map and see what jumps out at us. And in this case, you can immediately see where the roads are, whether or not the base map shows them. And then when you heat map it, you kind of get an idea of, okay, some intersections look like they're more hot than others. And when you hex bin them, you count up, yeah, the dark red hex bins have more accidents than the other hex bins. A policy map might be something a little more along the lines of this. We're concerned about accidents involving pedestrians overall. We'd like to focus on limiting or reducing the number of accidents near schools. So it begs the questions, where are the schools? And what is a reasonable walk distance around each school? So in white, you see the walkable area around each of these schools, and you see a quantification of the number of accidents nearby. So you can start to put context to the data, and this is the beginning of a policy map because it asks the question, do we have any higher rates of pedestrian vehicle incidents near schools? And if so, which schools? And therefore, where might we make specific interventions, whether they're short-term, like sending a police unit out to write tickets, or long-term, maybe involving changing the striping or the signage or something more permanent. So where do people use, and that's pretty much where people usually start with policy mapping is, you know, just like that image of the Titanic, usually there's some incident or event or something grabs our attention as a people or as an individual or as an organization. And in the case of the Titanic, it's pretty dramatic, right? This ship, allegedly unsinkable, sinks on its very first voyage. It's in all the papers. It's an uproar. It has a human impact, a devastating nature. And this is oftentimes analogous to what we map. We start off by mapping the symptoms of the problem, the accidents. It's brought to us as a government or an NGO or a business organization. It's brought to us for our attention that this doesn't seem right. This seems concerning. This is not who we want to be. We want to improve this. And a lot of times these data sets suddenly become useful once they are cast against some type of expectation or a goal or a national average. Let's talk about a couple examples. The Trust for Public Land publishes these maps they call Park Score, where they take every city in the U.S. and they look at its parks, and those are the dark green objects on the map, and they define a 10-minute walk around each park, and those are the light green areas. So in New York City and the Bronx, most of the area is light green. There's a lot of little parks throughout New York in addition to Central Park there at the top. Whereas Atlanta and Los Angeles, you know, I think the map maker was deliberate in choosing red and orange as sort of an alert color. Those are areas that do not have access, walkable access to a park nearby. And if they happen to be low socioeconomic status, they get a bright red color. In other words, they made a judgment. The Trust for Public Land is working with cities to kind of say, you know what, it's not just about building more parks, it's about building parks in the right places. Well, how do we define what the right places are? I mean, if you believe everybody needs access to a park, that's one thing. If you believe you can make a big impact in people's lives, how do you define that? In a similar way, a map we're going to show in a few minutes in more detail, the Los Angeles Clean Streets Index shows which streets in Los Angeles were evaluated as clean in green, somewhat clean in orange, and not clean in red. And of course, just like Zillow or any other site that you can type in your address and see how you're faring, citizens are going in to see, well, what's my neighborhood like? And that's different than mapping some raw data, some scientific measure of cleanliness, right? They made it simple. It's clean, it's somewhat clean, or it's not clean. If you're red, we're going to come visit your street soon. Similarly, we've got a nice story map to discuss in a minute about the opioid epidemic and some of the data in there and how mapping those visible symptoms starts a conversation. But oftentimes it's as useful to understand and explore and discuss the enabling infrastructure. Right? And what do I mean by that? Well, an iceberg floats on water. I would call water an enabling infrastructure. If the scientific characteristics of the water were to suddenly change and make icebergs float lower or higher, that would be interesting, right? I mean, we have to kind of understand the overall environment. In this case, you know, the image of the tugboat pushing the Titanic out to sea, that's enabling it to go do its job. And we're also concerned about that. When you map the symptoms, sometimes it's useful to kind of understand the context. In the same way you go to the doctor, they take your temperature, they check your blood pressure, they do all these screening things to get sort of a baseline. And then they start to eyeball you overall to see, what do we got here? Do you exercise much? They start to ask questions. So the enabling infrastructure is important. So for example, in that map of Pasadena pedestrian accidents, maybe the lack of sidewalks is a contributing factor. Well, how are we going to find that out unless we draw the sidewalks on the map and show that in relationship to the accidents? Another example we're talking about, another factor in policy mapping, you just have to recognize the fact that there is resistance to change in society or in organizations or in the nature of the problem. I put this image of the Titanic up because the policy was we're going to set a record for crossing the Atlantic. We made a decision, and that's, you know, we don't want to just get out there and sail across the Atlantic and take it easy. We want to set a record, and that's our policy. We're going to do it on a moonless night. I don't know why that image shows a moon. It actually was a moonless night, I've read. We've always done it this way. We've always sailed fast. We haven't had any problems before, and we're just going to go ahead and do this. So these are some of the factors that we have experienced over time in making policy maps for people that they may not have a direct impact on your decisions as a map maker, but it's good to understand, well, why would someone not want to reduce pedestrian accidents in a city? What would be the factors? Well, everybody believes in it, but it's going to cost money, or we don't want to approach it this way, we want to approach it another way. I like the fact that resistance to change is visually represented as a shark just cruising around with remoras everywhere. We have hidden causes to consider as well. In the case of Titanic, again, it was that desire to make a speed record that was sort of this quiet little contributing factor. Like with all problems, there's always something going on. And we've kind of observed that, as a society, the short-term repeating problems tend to have departments, right? There's a police department, a fire department, streets department, or in a business, you have a customer service department. And they kind of tend to put out the little fires day to day, but these folks could be invaluable in weighing in on what some of the root causes of the problems are and the infrastructure that's enabling it, whether it's an economic infrastructure, a social infrastructure, or literally, things on the earth we traditionally call infrastructure. These chronic problems are sometimes more deeply rooted and therefore more difficult to kind of feel confident that you're just going to put this on a map and boom, you're going to have a solution. But it is useful to use the Living Atlas and maps in general to find layers that help characterize, well, where is poverty in my town? I'm going to map, again, back to the pedestrian accidents. I want to map those accidents relative to a number of subjects because I'm kind of hunting for disparities. If you happen to have a lot of pedestrian accidents in a poorer part of town, your strategy for approaching that might be different than in, let's say, an industrial part of town where there's not a lot of people living there. So you've got to consider those facts, and the Living Atlas has a wide variety, thousands and thousands of layers that you can drop in underneath your data to kind of give it some context. A great example, Jennifer and I did a project for involving a Midwest city where they were looking at blight, and we were looking at the demographic layers and realizing, these are kind of the after effect of blight. When blight has taken hold, eventually it'll show up in the census numbers. These folks are interested in getting ahead of the game, right? They want to look at, I think they were telling us, they want to look at utility records. Who's late on payments to utilities, like literally having trouble keeping the lights on, as a possible early indicator of blight. And some of these other factors, they told us that aging populations sometimes are the very people who just can't afford to keep up their properties anymore, and they physically don't have the same energy they had in their 20s. I can relate to that a little. So we always try to ask people, are you mapping data? Are you mapping the symptoms? Are you mapping the deeper problem related to the symptoms? They're all connected. We're not saying you can't be successful just by mapping the symptoms. That's not the case. We always need to start there. But the more you dig, the more useful your policy maps are going to be. And then we have found we almost always run into a little bit of a conundrum. What are the expectations here? So let's go back to the pedestrian accidents. How many pedestrian accidents are acceptable? Now we can all sit around this table, this virtual table, and agree, none. We want none. I agree, we want none. That's not what I asked. In order to help a policy be judged as effective or ineffective, we have to set a goal. The United Nations has sustainable development goals. They're a gift to humanity. They define objectives by which we can judge ourselves. So what is the equivalent for your subject? Whether you're in government or in business, nonprofit, what are you trying to get to and how would you measure it? Some of these questions are unpleasant. How many opioid deaths per year are acceptable? And what we found is if you can't get an answer, and I understand why in these three examples, why it may be very difficult to get an absolute answer, a relative answer could be very powerful. What I mean is, well, how many opioid deaths per year, per area, something like that, do you have now? And what will your policy do to move that needle? And how far does that needle need to go before you declare success? For some things that are hard to get a handle on, you just want to move the needle in the positive direction. In other cases, no, you do want to set a goal to help people understand, are we making progress? So for example, the Trust for Public Land has set a goal that everybody should be within a 10-minute walk of a park. That's a very clear goal. Now, how do you do that? That's very difficult. In an urban area, it's actually a little easier. You got more people, more density, put a park down, it affects people instantly in a large way. But it's harder and harder as you move out towards the suburb and exurbs. So lastly, and then we'll move on to our examples. Where do we see GIS can help? Where do we see you can help? Whether you're a GIS practitioner, you put your hands on the software, or you're just someone who manages or asks for maps, this is a rough outline you can use to decide, well, what can I expect GIS to do? You know, if we were selling financial information software, we would be talking about how a financial analysis of policy is useful. But we're not. We're selling geographic software that helps you map the symptoms, as I mentioned, really map the problem, articulate clearly what is the problem. It's accidents. Where are they? And how are they concentrated? How many accidents should we normally expect given the amount of traffic on that particular road segment? Okay, looking at root causes, maybe there's some infrastructure questions, maybe showing areas of town that are resistant to change. Whatever that change is, maybe by law you cannot change certain things in this part of town. And as always, using, you know, once the data is visually represented on the map, now it is eligible to be spatially analyzed. And there's a whole series of webinars, classes, and workshops that Esri offers to really dive into the various ways you can spatially analyze data. Here's a key point though. Once you've decided to make a policy map versus I'm just making a map, a policy map in our definition, again, is where the opportunity to intervene is made clear. Once you commit to making that clear, you can also commit to mapping what your expected impact will be and tracking your progress along the way. And we've got a great example coming up. We'll show that in a second, the LA Clean Streets. And this is one of our little secret sauce methods for turning a map of data into a policy map. It's necessary to take an editorial position. A lot of times people who make maps for the first time, or even if they've made it for years, a lot of times they feel like, well, I put the data in the software and the software suggested these defaults and I accepted the default colors and breakpoints for my data and this is what the map says. And that's not quite the same as what I'm saying. Kind of in the same way, your resume is essentially a collection of facts, but we all take our resume and we structure it a certain way. We take an editorial position about our facts to explain why we're a good match for a position we're hiring. In the same way, a policy map takes a position and it makes things clear. What is normal, however you define normal, what is high or low based on what objective you have. So we're going to go, I'm going to stop this Prezi stuff and let's go into some interesting examples with the very capable Jennifer.
Yeah, hopefully no one's too dizzy from the Prezi over there. Thank you, Jim. That was such a great introduction to what a policy map is. So we started the webinar with a discussion on what's a policy map, what's the resistance to change, and how can GIS help. And so for the next half hour or so, Jim and I are going to dive deep into real-world examples of story maps that highlight what policy mapping is. And so I'm going to start with this map journal on the Clean Streets Index in Los Angeles that Jim introduced earlier, showing clean, somewhat clean, and not clean streets. And these are three images of what each of these categories may look like in the city. And it's pretty neat. The city drove over 22,000 miles and they recorded all the streets and they wrote down, let me click on one of the red streets. They wrote down, you know, is there a presence of bulky items, or is there a big couch, illegal dumping, or loose litter and weeds? And they accumulated these individual factors to create a score of 1, 2, or 3. And so this is something I'd like to point out with policy maps is that, as Jim mentioned earlier, we keep it very simple, easy to understand, and the opportunities here to intervene are the streets shown in red. And now what's really neat about this project is that the city does this every single quarter, and they're able to track the change over time to see if they're actually improving on the clean streets. And what they did here was they aggregated the streets into these grids. And these grids are what the Bureau of Sanitation uses to strategically assign cleanup crews to different areas around the city. And what I love about this is that since the start of the project, which was January of last year, there's been over an 80% reduction in both red grids and yellow grids. So that's pretty amazing. I mean,
That is.
LA is really getting ahead of the story. They are showing how they're improving the streets. Before, the city relied on individual citizens using the 311 phone calls, their emails, and reporting dirty streets. Now the city is taking a proactive approach and saying, listen, we know where all the dirty streets are. The goal that Mayor Eric Garcetti has set is by the end of 2018, there will be no red grids in LA. So that's a pretty amazing story. And what's great about these map journals and story maps in general is that you can embed them in your websites, which is what LA has done here. And LA did in fact get ahead of the story. I mean, with the Freedom of Information Act, any reporter can go to the city and say, hey, we know that you're driving these streets, give us your data. And who knows what they're going to present in the article. I saw this article from this year where the LA Times is applauding Mayor Eric Garcetti for the improvements to the streets and how much cleaner it has gotten. And of course, at the end of the article, he says there's a long way to go, but we're almost there. And so it's just a great example of how making a policy map that is simple, short, to the point, and getting ahead of the story can really help your organization.
That's an amazing story. You worked on this, you advised to that team, is that right?
That's correct.
So back here, building this story map out, the vision was we need to control our story, we need to tell our story. First of all, we need to do the work, right? That was the attitude. We need to get out and do the work. We're grateful for the citizens and the press for bringing this to our attention, but now we have to get to work. But they chose to let the public know this is the scope of the work, right? They didn't just summarize it in a simple paragraph in an article or on a website. They put the data out there to show them, look, this is us. We all need to work together to address this. And what I particularly enjoy is they simplified their data. I remember you showing me this data, and the brilliance of their approach was, let's not make this a technical map. It's real simple. Your street is clean, or it's not clean, or it's somewhere in between, right? I think that was a very powerful move because it sets the bar. What's our expectation? Green everywhere.
Right. And notice how, go back to this map right here, notice how there isn't a legend that you have to decipher.
What? I thought all maps have to have a legend.
No. So here the text is color-coded to match the map. And so the reader has a legend in front of them, but they may not know it. It's natural.
So in this case, they kind of said, let's kind of make this as straightforward as possible. You could put a legend in. It's not that we're anti-legend, but in this case, it's so simple.
Right.
You can just kind of visually see.
Right. And if you are interested in viewing this story map, you can go to the Living Atlas of the World app, livingatlas.arcgis.com, and search Los Angeles Clean Streets. And here you can find the application or the story map that we just showed, the feature layers to work with in your own map, as well as the web map, which is a good starting point to add your individual layers to it.
So in my mind, I think we've talked about this before, that web mapping application is sort of the equivalent of the LA Times article showing an interactive map of this subject.
Right.
But the difference is we show our work. The city of LA is showing its work. Here's the feature layer. You can plug this into your own map of LA. Maybe you're going to do a project that also touches upon the issue of having clean streets. And here's the layer. You don't have to go download the data and upload it onto a server and then put it in your map. It's just a layer. You touch it, and when you touch it, it's going to display here with a nice explanation, right? Where did that explanation come from?
So this is something that you have to have before nominating your item to the Living Atlas. And once you nominate your item, such as this, a curator from the Living Atlas will look at your description and your summary, as well as your tags and credits and use constraints. And they'll work with you to get it to a good point where it can be housed in the Living Atlas.
So some people call this metadata, but we tend to refer to it as what's the minimum explanation to understand what is this layer? It's called the Clean Streets Index 2016 Q1 for quarter one. In one sentence, what is this layer? It's the first of its kind grading system of every street in Los Angeles. Oh, okay, I'm interested. What is this layer? And you get a full description with links to additional information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, this thing is something that can be nominated to the Living Atlas. As you said, a curator can take a quick look at it. And if it's accepted, now this layer is not just sitting on some server behind the firewall at the city of LA.
Right.
It's publicly available. Maybe it's even an open data layer at this point. And it's in the Living Atlas so that someone who's in ArcGIS or online or in ArcMap or in ArcPro can just say, yeah, I heard about that clean streets layer. Let me do a quick search in the Living Atlas. Yep, there it is. Let me add it to my map. No download, no FTP. You're ready to go. It's ready to use.
Makes our lives a lot easier.
We like that.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to the second of the 4 examples, and Jim's going to talk about kindergarteners and immunizations in California. This is a story map created by our coworker, Diana Lavery.
Yeah, Diana came across a data set on a State of California website regarding immunizations. And what was particularly interesting is the data set was summarized by school district. And it turns out there is a California school immunization law that requires that children receive immunizations before entering school. And in this particular school year, 92.8% of California kindergartners had received those immunizations. And as always, those statewide or nationwide figures, those are interesting to us because turns out there can be variation by school districts. Mm-hmm. So Diana put this story map together to kind of tell that story. If we kind of zoom in here, and this particular school district, the Ravendale-Termo Elementary School District, you can see sort of a history of immunization data. They didn't have data for 2010 or 11, but as we move through the years, you can see they kind of made some progress in 2013 and 14, and then they seem to have a big setback in that particular year, right? So this map is sort of color-coded so that areas in red are an alert color, and sorry about that, let me just get that right there. And areas in gray are more normal, right? So if I click on a dark gray area, look at that 99% immunization rate in the most recent year. Or where are we? We're down here in Southern California, and we're here in Redlands, and we're only at 95%. And I forget, what was the target goal? It was like 90%?
So the target goal, I believe, was 98 or 95?
Yeah, the average was 98.
Oh, yeah. So you want a 95% threshold.
Yeah, it's almost like she anticipated my inability to remember things and put the information right there in the story map. So what I love about policy maps when they're embedded in a story is you don't have to expect the user to decipher the map. You can tell them exactly what the deal is. Districts that have met the safest threshold of 95% are in gray, and any district below that 95% threshold are in a shade of red. If you're dark red, you're probably pretty low. That's 84% in that case. Another dark red, 83%. This one's a little pinker, so it's progressing. It's at 93%. And then, like I said, some of these ones, like look at this one, it's just barely on the side of red. It's at 95.3%. So they're right at the edge, right? And they're probably within the margin of error, right? So that's why this is an interesting map in total. Again, she took that data off of an FTP site, created a layer out of it in ArcGIS online, and then nominated her item to the Living Atlas. She put the web mapping application in so that the story is told using a story map, but also in a kind of a show your work method, here's the feature layer in case anyone else wants to take advantage of this resource. That's the pattern we encourage.
All right, so this is the third out of the 4 story maps that we're going to share today. And this is a story map that our team created in honor of International Women's Day this year. It's called Celebrating Women's Rights. This is a cascade story map that highlights the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. And these Sustainable Development Goals were set last year, and they are trying to achieve these extraordinary things by 2030. And so this particular story map highlights a few of these goals that relate directly to women. one being good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, and decent work and economic growth. Now for this webinar, I'm just going to cover one of the goals, which is good health and well-being. And within every single goal, there are these targets, 12 to 15 different targets that, like Jim said earlier, the United Nations gave a gift to humanity, giving these individual numbers or these goals within these targets so we can see, are we on the right track to meeting this goal, who's meeting it, who's not. So one target for good health is to reduce the global maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 mothers' deaths per 100,000 live births. Another target is to ensure universal access to health care. So for this webinar, I'm just going to show one of the maps in this story map. This one shows the maternal mortality ratio. So in the Central African Republic, which is highlighted here, 882 women die for every 100,000 live births. And when we compare this to Finland's 3 women for every 100,000 live births, we can really see this stark difference between developing and developed nations. And now, I want to point something out. This map is currently using a mono, kind of dichromatic color scheme where it goes from a darker gray to a brighter purple. So your eyes, of course, look at this brighter purple, but Jim, really 9 out of 10 times for a policy map, I would not recommend this color scheme. But with policy maps, you do have to consider your audience. So we chose this color scheme because we were giving a presentation to a group of United Nations members, and we wanted to be extra sensitive to not, pinpoint anyone as you're failing to meet the goal or you are meeting the goal. So we chose this more sensitive color scheme.
So it's about knowing your audience.
Exactly.
If you're going to make, for example, we're on a different project with a city about crime mapping.
Mm-hmm.
The internal maps we discuss are very frank and open.
Yes.
And then how do they message that? It might be the case you don't want to be so dramatic with your color choices,
Right.
because in the hands of the public, they might draw the wrong conclusion. They might draw an overly aggressive alert status, whereas, no, we're just trying to illuminate the differences in the data.
Right.
That's what we mean by an editorial position is
Exactly.
you've got to really consider the audience. That's the point, right?
Right. And that's what Diana did with her story map. She chose a more muted red and a more muted blue, and she's not punishing the school districts with a bright tomato red.
Yes.
All right, so if we were to take this map and map it in the way that I would 9 out of 10 times, let me show you how I would do that. So far you've seen the Prezi and the map journal and the Cascade. Now we're in the ArcGIS Online map viewer. And as many of you probably know, we create the map in the map viewer, and then we put these maps in the story map. And so if we go into this layers symbology, we can see that it's using the high to low theme. And so if we look at the ramps, we can see it's usually 1, maybe 2 colors, and that's what we're currently using. With a lot of our policy maps, we like to use the above and below theme.
Oh yeah, show what that does.
All right, so let's look at the ramps. We see 2 different colors, and because I'm using a dark gray base map, Smart Mapping realizes that the middle of the ramps need to be gray so that they kind of fade into the story map, and you're just looking at into the map, and you're just looking at the high and low values.
So that's an editorial position. Stuff in the middle that's average or quote-unquote normal, it's on the map, but it's not as important as the exceptionally good or the exceptionally bad.
Exactly.
Is that right?
That's right. And in this case, I want to invert this color ramp so that when people above the value of 70, which is the goal, or the target, are shown in orange in Africa, and then people who are meeting the goal are shown in a bright blue. Now, there are these colors that are kind of like a grayish orange that it's in the middle. So 80, they're pretty close to meeting that goal, or maybe a darkish grayish blue, 68. they're just 2 from under the goal. So they're kind of straddling the line there. And this story map can be found in the Living Atlas as well. And I used the dark gray human geography dark base map, which I'll show later in the live build of a story map.
Yeah, we got to get to that.
Yeah.
We can skip mine and go directly to that, I think.
Okay. That sounds good.
So we want to leave time for questions, and this is one of the heart of the matter is how do I actually build this? That's
what I really like. Jim and I have been doing this recently in presentations where we'll do a live build of the web map or a live build of the story map to demystify the idea of policy mapping, to show how accessible it is.
Oh, it's mysterious.
It's so mysterious. All right, so I'm going to take the role of, say, a GIS analyst for the city of Houston. And I've got this layer that shows Superfund sites around my city. And these are sites that the federal government has deemed absolutely necessary to clean up. These are sites that may affect the environment and the people surrounding it. And so say the city received a certain amount of funding from the government to clean up these sites, but we don't have enough to clean every single site. So I am tasked with finding a data-driven approach to prioritizing, which sites should we clean up first. Now, just like the LA Clean Streets map where it's green to red, this is also the same color scheme where each of the sites is given a site score. And the red sites are the ones that we want to prioritize first, the ones with the higher scores, or the dirtier sites in a sense. And I'm interested in selecting sites that are within a flood zone. And I currently don't have this data, but let's see what the Living Atlas has. So I'll go to Add and browse the Living Atlas layers. And I can browse within the map or show Esri layers only, and I can select from a variety of categories and subcategories. In this case, I will search for flood. And we've got all these layers that show up that are related somehow to floods, and we can hover over each of the items to get a description. I'm going to add the USA flood risk layer to my map. And right now the map looks a little busy. Jim, can you describe why it's so busy?
Well, it's got a lot of color.
Yeah.
It's got a relatively neutral base map. The floodwaters came in an interesting bright purple.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when we try to make policy maps, we try to decide, we recommend to people, if you start from a blank canvas, it's often better than starting from a very busy map that you might use for navigation. Because when people make maps for navigation or as sort of a general reference map, they try to fit in as many pieces of information as possible. So a lot of times we just need to simplify the map to let our story come through.
Right. Notice how the layers, the labels in the map are covered by the layers.
Oh, that, yeah.
So, yeah, let's
polish that up maybe.
Let's add one of my favorite base map from the Living Atlas, and it's called the Human Geography Dark Base Map. There's also the light gray version of this base map as well. And we like to call this the base map sandwich because we're adding the dark gray base at the bottom, and then we're going to add the details and the labels on top. And so I'll send both of these layers down to the base map and set my label. So notice Houston is currently covered. I'm going to set that as a reference layer. And now it's clearer, it's less busy. I can even set the transparency on the details layer, which is the streets.
This seems like a little thing, like a detail thing, but man, when you are in front of a CEO or a director or somebody who has very little time,
right,
like it or not, they're going to judge your map in about 3 seconds. So it's important to get the details right, and the fact that it's easy to do is nice. The Living Atlas has a number of base maps available to try.
Right, and I liked the poll in the beginning because a lot of you said that one of the hardest parts of making the map is choosing the best analysis tools. And so what I wanted look at today are two analysis tools. First, I'm going to geo-enrich the sites to show how many people live within a mile of each of these sites. And I'll select from many different variables that you can choose from. In this case, 2017 total population is what I'm interested in, but there are other variables such as spending behavior, poverty, education, jobs. One other variable we could be interested in this analysis could be people who don't have a car. So if there's a natural disaster like a hurricane, these are the areas where people are most vulnerable, people who don't have cars to get out. But in this case, we'll just do one and apply it. And I like the default of a line buffer distance of 1 mile, but you can also choose walking time, driving distance, even trucking time. And I'll call this population within 1 mile of sites and run the analysis.
So you're asking the Living Atlas to go, and ArcGIS Online, to go geo-enrich this set of Superfund sites and find out how many people live within a mile of each of those colored dots on the map.
Right.
How much data did you FTP over? None.
I didn't, yeah.
You're just connecting to services,
Easy.
and that's the
Exactly.
new paradigm for WebGIS is I don't have to FTP or download things. I can still do that. Those resources still exist out there. But you just connected to a flood layer you don't own or manage, and you connected to this enrichment service to ask the census essentially a question. Ask Esri Demographics a question. How many people live near it?
Right, and now it's joined that question, how many
cool.
people live near here, with my site data that was already in the layer. And so I can see how many people live within each of the sites. The smaller circle is less people, the larger circle is more people. I can add the attribute twice, and now it's not only mapping by size, but it's by mapping by size and by color. And I've set the symbology already in a way that shows the sites with less people around it are shown in a dark gray. And the sites with over 16,000 people around it within a mile are shown in a white, brighter color and a larger symbol.
So your editorial position is starting to come clear, literally.
Right. Your eyes are drawn to the brighter, whiter areas because it contrasts with the base map. And then the last part of this analysis, I have 3 different criteria that I want to input into this Find Existing Locations tool. And what this tool does is it looks at a series of criteria that I specify, and it selects from my existing features, in this case, the Superfund sites. All right, so I am interested in sites where the population is greater than 8,000, which was the average. And I'm also interested in selecting sites where the site score is greater than 40. And lastly, I want to choose sites that intersect the flood area, which is the Living Atlas layer that we added. You can also choose from a Living Atlas analysis layer here as well. So you can add the Living Atlas layers as visualizations, but you can also use them in your analysis. And I'll call this Prioritized Sites and run the analysis.
So this is going to answer the policy question we had. With all these Superfund sites, where do we need to work? And
Right.
one consideration is, well, does it lie in a floodplain? Because that could be a significant issue. And the second is, are there a lot of people around it? And there could be other criteria, of course, as the conversation ensues with the people who are local to the area. They might add additional criteria to help us shape our analysis. But at this point, we've been able to take some of the symptoms, the existence of Superfund sites, some of the enabling infrastructure, where are the people around that, and we're concerned about their presence in a floodplain, which enables bad things to happen when floods do arrive with regard to what's in these Superfund site locations.
And the analysis just completed. It's like 20, 30 seconds to run, whereas before we had these tools, we would have to run filters and do spatial intersections and joins and yada yada. So I definitely don't take these tools for granted. I've symbolized this area with a transparent white and a solid outline to show these are the 3 sites that we need to prioritize first. They're located within flood zones. They have a lot of people that they may impact, and they have a high score shown in red and orange. Now, Jim, is this something that we would show the mayor or the decision maker? Would we show them this map viewer and send them that URL?
You know, I would never show that in the same way I wouldn't show the mayor some detailed spreadsheet of a financial analysis of their campaign plan or their policy plan. I would show a summary level thing. How might I do that here?
Well, one way is to save the map and then share it out as a web app or a story map. In this case, I'm just sharing one map. So I'm going to select something from the Showcase a Map section. And my favorite 3 are Basic Viewer, Map Styler, and the Minimalist app. If you wanted to build a story map, you could do so.
Right there. Oh.
Yeah, you could do it here. These are all templates, so that makes it very easy for you to share your map with the world. Today we saw the Cascade and the Story Map Journal, but there's many more that you can choose from. And so let's see. I don't have to create the web app at first. What I recommend to all of you guys here today is start by exploring what templates there are to offer, and by hitting this preview button with your maps, so that you don't have to create the item and then end up having to...
So this thing, do I have this right? You created a web map that you're basically happy with. You reviewed it with a few people, and you just injected it into an app at a preview.
Yeah.
So you can decide whether or not this is the final information product you want to go out there with.
Right. Is this the app I want, or do I want to use the Minimalist app?
That's fantastic. I mean, it wasn't that many years ago where the only way to make that happen was to hire a programmer into your organization or outsource it.
Right.
So this is nice that you can just get this started immediately and get conversations moving.
Yeah, you share this URL out to the decision makers, or you pull it up on your iPad or your mobile device. It works cross-platform. And
after you review it and
of course,
get permission and all that.
I mean, as the GIS analyst, I may not be the expert in the politics or the funding, the finances, but I am the expert in making data-driven decisions and using the Living Atlas and tools that are available.
That's really cool, and I think you and I have talked many times about the fact that sometimes we start with an outline of a story. We have it in our heads, like LA streets. They came to you with the story they had envisioned, and then it was how do we back that into the actual data available. Other times we start with data, like Diana's immunization story. We don't really have a policy proposal. We have an observation that bad things happen when these rates dip below 95%. So it's a fair question. Where are the areas in our state that have already dipped below 95%?
Right.
Well, that's fantastic. We want to allow time for questions, but hopefully what you've seen here today is how we tie together policy mapping by mapping symptoms to start. That's usually where anyone who's involved with making a map, or anyone who has their hands on some data and they know mapping is possible, but they don't know what they want. We always recommend the first step, just start mapping the data. First of all, you might see that your data is clean, or you might see that your data has issues. You got to get that cleaned up. Then you start to map exactly what is the problem. In the case of Superfund sites, it's we have a lot, but we don't have enough money to clean them all up or to address them in certain ways. So what are we going to do about it? Start mapping root causes and possible resistance to whatever policy you want to enable. And by starting to map, well, what do we hope our impact will be for this policy, you're kind of setting the bar. In the case of clean streets, the bar is we want them all green by 2018. And that's pretty, that rhymes. So we want them all green by 2018. And often we find ourselves surprised as map makers and cartographers, geographers, how this all just sort of coalesces suddenly. It's really almost like how policy mapping to me sometimes is like going into a fine restaurant, and if you get to sit in the kitchen and watch how they do it, you're amazed. But then when you start to break it down, you're like, oh, that makes total sense. I mean,
I can do it too.
Yeah, I could do it, allegedly. But I think policy mapping is within the reach of anyone who is using modern GIS tools and has access to data. And the Living Atlas, certainly by having thousands and thousands of items in it, layers and data, base maps, the options for all of us are much greater than ever before.
All right. Awesome.
Questions?
Great. Yes, we had a few questions come through. Unfortunately, we only have time for I'd say maybe one right
We'll
now.
go fast. We'll go fast.
But if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the questions panel, and I'll also be giving out Jim and Jennifer's email addresses and their Twitter handle along with my email address. So if you want to email any of us directly, feel free, or I will follow up. If you ask a question through the questions panel and we don't have time to get to it, I'll make sure we follow up with you over the next couple of days. But one quick question that's a really good question, a really practical question is, you used a lot of data from the Living Atlas in a lot of these maps. How would you go about citing that as a source?
Well, that's a great, yeah, you want to show Diana's? Usually at the end of every story map, we'll try to provide citations, both technically, what is the URL to the item or the inspiration for the map, as well as who provided it, what organization. So the story map is a great place. In addition, every ArcGIS Online item has a spot, so if I just open one of these, has a spot where you can provide your citation information down here in the credits, and that information appears on every map made from that layer.
Yeah, and within the map viewer, say, you added the USA flood risk layer and you want more information.
Yeah, it's down there in the corner.
Yeah,
show
item detail. Yeah.
That's how you find it in an existing map. And that's why we encourage people, and the whole reason we have people nominate an item to the Living Atlas is it gives the person who's creating the item a chance to kind of critically review what information am I providing on the page you see on screen that would help explain what is this, what is its proper use, where did it come from, how often will it be updated if that's the case, etc.
All right, great, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and switch gears here and take back over the presentation.
Will you send us the rest of the questions so we can follow up?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I will definitely be sending you the questions.
Thank you.
And here's Jim and Jennifer's email addresses and their Twitter handles. You can also contact them directly if you have questions, but again, I'll be following up with them. If you have any general feedback for the webinar, please feel free to send me an email at tgrant@esri.com. When the webinar is finished, there will be a survey that pops up. It'll take you maybe a minute or two to answer. Please answer the survey questions. That'll help us continue to improve our webinars. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. That's where we share tips and tricks, the latest announcements related to the Living Atlas. We'll be sharing the link to the recording in those locations, so be sure to follow us and like us. The recording will be sent in a follow-up email and posted online, and keep an eye out for more webinars in the new year. So I want to thank everyone for attending and thank our presenters for presenting.
Thanks for setting all this up, Tamara. You did a great job.
Yeah, it's great.
No problem. All right. Thank you and have a great day.